In this video, Jordan Peterson explains why you should bring how you act into alignment with what you say you believe.
The existentialists also adopted that viewpoint. They were concerned with the quality of subjective experience. Not that they were ignoring the reality of objective experience, but they were concerned with the reality of subjective experience. And they're also more focused on action than on statement or belief. Because here's something to think about. You can think about this for a very long time. If you're trying to understand what someone believes, even if you're trying to analyze their representations of the world, should you pay attention to how they act or what they say? And that's a profound question, even from a neurological perspective or a neuropsychological perspective, because the memory system that you use to represent what you say that you believe is not the same memory system that you use to embody your knowledge about action. So it's akin, I would say, to the distinction between telling someone how to ride a bike and knowing how to ride a bike. Those are not the same things. The descriptions don't even really lay very well on top of one another, because you don't actually know how you ride a bike. You just know how to do it. It's built into your physiology, right? It's a skill. And that's called procedural memory. And procedural memory is the same kind of memory that basically structures your perceptions. It's not that you can't orient your perceptions consciously, because you can. But once you've oriented them consciously, say towards some goal, it's automatic procedures that take over, because you really don't know how it is that you organize your senses so that you can pay attention. You just know how to do it. Now, the existentialists believed that actions spoke louder than words, and that if you were interested in belief, and even if you were interested in analyzing belief, that it was better for you to look at how someone acted than what they said. Now, one of the things that you might think with regards to Rogers is that his psychotherapeutic practice would be predicated on the idea that you should bring how you act into alignment with what you say you believe, so that there's no discontinuity between your body, that's one way of thinking about it, and your mind, and so that there are fewer paradoxes in the way that you manifest yourself in the world. So the concentration on action is one of the fundamental characteristics of existentialism. Another one is the insistence upon trouble and suffering as an intrinsic element of human experience. So you could say we could concentrate on subjective experience. What's your life like to you? How do you experience it? And we could say, well, built into that is trouble. Built into that is chaos. Built into that is anxiety and pain and disease, and that you can fall prey to those things without there being something wrong with you. Now, if you pin down a psychoanalyst like Jung or Freud, they would, of course, admit that human misery is endemic to human experience. But Freud, in particular, tended to look for adult psychopathology in childhood misadventure, in pathological childhood experience. And he, at least implicitly, claimed that if you hadn't experienced childhood trauma and you had developed properly, that what would happen is that you would end up healthy, roughly speaking, certainly mentally sound. But the existentialists, they don't really buy that perspective right from the beginning. They basically make a different claim, which is that life is so full of intrinsic misery, let's say, but suffering is a better way of thinking about it, suffering that manifests itself as a consequence of your intrinsic vulnerability, that psychopathology is built into the human experience. There's no real way of avoiding it, or at least there's no reason to look for extra causes. That might be a better way of thinking about it. And you'd be surprised how often that sort of observation is useful for clinical clients, for example, because one of the things that's quite characteristic about people, especially if they're introverted and they don't have very many friends, they don't have people to talk to, if they're suffering, maybe they're depressed or anxious, or they have some sets of strange symptoms like agoraphobia or obsessive compulsive disorder, one of the things they always presume that is that the fact that they're suffering in that manner means that there's something, not only something wrong with them, but something uniquely wrong with them, so that it's their fault and no one else is like them. And one of the things you do as a diagnostician, you know, you'll hear a lot of rattling about how labeling is bad for people, and certainly mislabeling is bad for people, and even an accurate label can be a box that you can't get out of. But it's very, very frequently the case that if you diagnose someone, it's a relief to them like you can't believe, because they come in to see you knowing that something isn't going properly, but they think, well, they're the only person facing it, and that means they're idiosyncratically strange in some incomprehensible way that no one else could possibly understand, and there's no way they could ever get better. And one of the things you do is point out to them is like, yeah, depression and anxiety doesn't really require any explanation, right? There's plenty of reason. I don't remember who said it. Everyone has sufficient justification for suicide. I think that was the claim. Well, but the point is that if you look through the experiences of the typical person, unless they're very, very fortunate, and they won't be that way forever, that's certainly the case, that they can point to traumatic experiences in their life, death and loss and illness and humiliation and all those sorts of things, that are sufficient to account for existence in a state of quasi-permanent negative emotion. Now, often if you see, as I said, if you see people who are depressed and anxious by nature, they assume that everyone else is the smiling face that you see on Facebook, and so that alienates them from other people and themselves even more than certainly far more than necessary. And part of the psychoeducation that goes along with therapy is merely educating people to understand that a fair bit of misery is the norm, and that there's plenty of genuine reason for it. And so the existentialists basically start from that stance. It's like a fall of man stance in some sense, you know, because deeply rooted in the Western tradition, roughly speaking, is the idea that people are divorced from some early paradisal state, and that it was the emergence of something like self-consciousness that produced that demolition of humanity and left us in a damaged state. And I mean, people think they don't believe that, but they believe it all the time. And it's frequently how people experience themselves, you know, as if there's something wrong that needs to be rectified. And it seems unique in some sense to human beings. It doesn't seem all that obvious that animals think that way, but people definitely think that way. And so, well, the existentialists basically take that as a given. And then they offer another question, which is, well, given that that's your lot and that there's ample reason for misery, how is it that you should conduct yourself? Because merely, say, giving into that misery or multiplying it doesn't seem to do anything but multiply it. It doesn't seem to do anything but increase it. Now, so if it's bad to begin with, you might say, well, increasing it is something that you have to regard as worse. So how do you conduct yourself in the face of misery? Okay, so how do they present that to begin with? Well, this is from Pascal, and this is an existential statement that describes the position of the individual in the universe, you might say, or you could say that it explains a deep characteristic of individual experience or existence, hence existentialism.